Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody, wherever this finds you, and welcome to this webinar hosted by UNIDIR and the Oslo Nuclear Project on understanding public opinion on nuclear weapons through a gendered lens. My name's James Revel. I'm delighted to be able to moderate this event, and I should note from the outset that this event is being recorded, although I would encourage you all to speak freely and frankly in the discussion. To kick us off with this discussion, and without further ado, I'm delighted to be able to hand the floor to my UNIDIR colleague, Renata Dalaqua, who is going to provide some opening remarks. Renata is the head of the Gender and Disarmament Program with UNIDIR, and the floor is yours, Renata.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you everyone who has joined. It's a pleasure to be here with you today in this webinar, which, as Jamie already said, is being organized by UNIDIR and the Oslo Nuclear Project. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss the issue of public opinion on nuclear weapons through a gender lens. From a scholarly perspective, we have seen many articles on public opinion and nuclear weapons lately. It has become a prolific area of study, but only a few of those have examined these issues through a gender lens. So I really commend the authors, Willio and Professor Michal Onderco, who are joining us today for taking up this challenge and writing the paper, Public Opinion on Nuclear Weapons, Is There a Gender Gap? So this paper was published by UNIDIR earlier this year in the edited volume From the Margins to the Mainstream, Advancing Intersectional Analysis of Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And this is an edited volume, a collection with 5 different papers examining a range of issues, one of them, public opinion on nuclear weapons, but also justice claims from nuclear survivors and feminist foreign policies in Latin America. I mean, various topics that benefit from a gender approach. If you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to download the publication from UNIDIR's website and have a look at the articles. This collection, this project, is a result of an effort carried out by UNIDIR Gender and Disarmament Program. We worked with a diverse group of experts to uncover new issues that could benefit from being examined, not only through a gender lens, but also through an intersectional analysis. And here it's important to take a step back and actually explain what we mean by gender and intersectional analysis. So a gender analysis examines the relationships between people of all genders and the power dynamics that underpin those relationships. And an intersectional analysis addresses diversity within certain groups, within gender groups, by examining how gender intersects with other aspects, such as age, religion, sexual orientation, class, ethnicity, among others. And I think this point about intersectionality is very relevant to the discussion we will have today. As Ellen and Michal will tell us, gender is not only the relevant category for analysis in the case of public opinion. Their research shows also that age, nationality, for instance, also matters in this case. So today we'll dive into the findings of the paper and also discuss the implications of this research for nuclear advocacy, policymaking, and scholarship. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what all the panelists will have to say today. And I mean, I'm hoping, and I can speak for UNIDIR Gender and Disarmament Program, we hope that this discussion will contribute to diversifying perspectives in nuclear research, advocacy, and policy making. And this is important to pave the way for new and inclusive efforts towards nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. So I think I'll stop here now and hand over back to you, Jamie. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Renata, for providing context to this discussion, and we certainly echo the point on diversifying perspectives. I think that's extremely important. I'd now like to turn to the authors of the paper, Ms. Ellen Willio and Dr. Michal Onderco. But before doing so, I'll just provide a short introduction. Ellen holds a bachelor's degree in socioeconomic sciences and is currently pursuing a master's degree in international relations and diplomacy at the University of Antwerp, where she focuses on international security. Primary areas of interest include Middle East studies, as well as arms control and proliferation, particularly concerning nuclear weapons. Dr. Michal Onderco is a full professor of international relations in the Department of Public Administration and Sociology at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and his interests lie in the institutional structures for governing international security, including their origins and their functioning. I understand Ellen is going to lead the discussion, so perhaps I can turn to you. The screen is yours, Ellen.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you all. I will now share the PowerPoint that we prepared. So today I'm going to present the paper that Michal and I wrote on the gender differences in nuclear weapons attitudes. So first of all, nuclear weapons have played and still play a central role in international peace and security debates. And while experts, politicians, and military leaders often dominate these conversations, public opinion also plays a crucial role when shaping nuclear weapon policies, and this especially in democratic nations where leaders are responsive to the views of their citizens. So this responsiveness means that when public opinion changes, that leaders, they notice these changes and they will respond to these changes accordingly. And one an important but relatively unexplored issue is that attitudes toward nuclear weapons can vary between different demographic groups within society. So one aspect of public opinion that deserves more attention, in our opinion, is that the potential differences in attitudes between men and women. The aim of the paper was to explore whether and to what extent there is a gender gap in public views on nuclear weapons. And this specifically in proliferation, nuclear use, and arms control. And while while gender has come to the fore when discussing nuclear weapons issues, and while there has been a long history of research studying gender gaps in public opinion in different policy areas, such as in the use of force, there is little quantitative empirical work on differences in attitudes between men and women on these issues. So why is exploring the gender gap important? Firstly, if there are systemic differences between men and women, this would highlight how important it is to have gender diversity among decision makers. So having both men and women among decision makers, this would help bring a variety of perspectives to the table, which is a proven asset to decision making. Different views lead to better discussions and to more possible solutions, which can create stronger and more effective policies. Here I would also like to refer to Louis Reitman, who wrote a paper which was also included in a volume on the scientific case for diversity in nuclear weapon policymaking, where he highlights the advantages of having a diverse team and moreover underscores the importance of demographic diversity in nuclear weapon policymaking. Thus, finding gender differences would stress the case to incorporate different perspectives and thereby would strengthen the case for advocating for diverse team in policymaking. Decision-making teams that are more representative of the populations they serve, gender-wise but also otherwise, are better equipped to reflect and to respond to a full range of public concerns and values. Gender diversity in institutions dealing with nuclear weapon policy could lead to more inclusive, but also more equitable and more socially responsive policies. It would also build greater public trust as citizens see their views and their concerns represented at the highest level. So examining these gender-based differences in public opinion could also highlight potential areas of polarization. It is important for policymakers to be aware of these divides in order to allow for more targeted and inclusive policy responses. And by shedding light on potential gender differences in public opinion towards nuclear weapons, we try to contribute to a more informed and nuanced understanding of how the public perceives these critical issues. In our paper, we first analyzed the effect of public opinion on policy change. So many scholars agree that public opinion is a driver of policy change, but this effect is dependent on salience. So when the issue is highly salient, so meaning that citizens exhibit a significant level of concern and find that these policies are very important, they're more inclined to consider these actions of elected officials on these issues when voting. So leaders will more adapt their policies to the preferences of the citizens when these issues are more important to the public, because otherwise they fear electoral punishment. Previous studies have concluded that domestic issues are more salient to the public because people generally care more about issues that are closer to home. So this is why that responsiveness is also found to be higher in domestic issues. However, there's recent studies that contradict these findings and say that for issues such as defense and foreign policy, policymakers are actually more responsive or just as responsive as to domestic issues. So when we look at nuclear weapon policy issues, which is actually as well a domestic issue as a foreign policy issue, we see that the salience of nuclear weapons has really fluctuated over time. So during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were very salient, especially in countries such as the US and in the UK, because a lot of people were very concerned about nuclear weapons. They were concerned about the use. There were also a lot of public demonstrations when it comes to nuclear weapons. But after the Cold War, these nuclear weapons issues kind of faded from the minds of the public. But now, because of international events such as the nuclear program of North Korea, because of Iran, because of Putin, who was threatening to use nuclear weapons again, the salience really increased again surrounding nuclear weapons. In our paper, we also concluded a short analysis of the previous studies that studied the gender differences in attitudes towards the use of force. So here, for example, Eichenberg in 2003 found a pronounced gender gap in support for military intervention, with women being less likely than men to endorse the government's use of force. And they also showed greater sensitivity to the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. And moreover, Shapiro and Conover in 1993, they found that gender differences in attitudes are more pronounced in emotional responses, and this especially in real-time conflicts like wars. So when women and men were presented with hypothetical cases of war, there was not a real gender gap found, but when these issues were represented in real-time events. So when a real war was presented to these women and men, then the gender gap widened, and women were more opposed to the use of force and were more concerned about the human cost. So in this way, they found that the gender gap was context-driven, and they also found that it was socially constructed. So they didn't really saw evidence of men being inherently more aggressive or more supportive of war, but they saw that that there was actually early learning of there was an early development of distinct cognitive and emotional orientations towards conflict. So, for example, women in particular are not taught to avoid violence entirely, but they tend to delay its use and escalate it more gradually and experience more emotional distress compared to men. And this was socially learned. Then if we go to the methods, so we used a comprehensive review of articles and surveys. And articles and surveys we used were articles where that's the differences between men and women were highlighted, and also surveys where there were different responses between men and women. And this spanning from 1990 and 2023. And we covered 47 different countries. And in this sense, we tried to really broaden the geographical scope and to limit the Western bias. Our main research question was, are there significant differences between men and women when it comes to these attitudes? And if there were already differences reported, so if the effect between men and women was already reported, we used that in our analysis. But otherwise, when only the percentages of women and men answering these questions was reported, we calculated the Z-score for two population proportions in order to discover whether there was a significant difference between men and women. And this data was also was comprised in an appendix, and this appendix is also online available. So if you look at the results for nuclear proliferation, we saw that women seem to show higher aversion to nuclear proliferation than men. And a possible explanation can be that women were also found to view nuclear weapons as hazardous. So they saw more risk in having nuclear weapons. They also were more afraid of the catastrophic and uncontrollable consequences of nuclear weapons, while men tend to see them as providing security. And among the millennials, and the millennials is a reference to a study of the Red Cross in 2019, where 16 countries were analyzed. We found that there is no difference in the endorsement of the core non-proliferation norms. So when men and women were asked whether countries who didn't have nuclear weapons should obtain them, there was no difference in answering. There was no difference found in men and women answering this question. However, in the same survey, women were found to be less likely than men to support the country in developing or keeping nuclear weapons. Then there were also some context-specific findings that were interesting. So in Japan, for example, a study found that women were less supportive of the nuclear option. However, when there was a deterioration in the nuclear environment, so when there were more threats, then women actually were not necessarily more opposed to the nuclear option. And in South Korea, we found no gender differences. Then if we go to the results on gender differences in attitudes toward nuclear use, we found that when women tend to be less supportive of the use in various settings. So, for example, in Australia, a study found that men were more likely to indicate that some nuclear weapons are necessary for the use in extreme threats, while women were opposed to that idea. And women, moreover, showed more nuclear anxiety. So they showed more distress when thinking about the use of nuclear weapons, and more fear, while men showed more nuclear denial. So nuclear denial is when people downplay the effects of radiation. And surprisingly, in other studies, mainly in the US, we found no gender differences or even evidence of a reversed pattern. So here, a study of Sagan and Valentino in 2017, for example, they found that women in the US were just as likely, or in some cases even more likely than men, to support the idea of sacrificing large numbers of civilians, so in a nuclear attack, in order to prevent deaths of US soldiers. So this was actually very surprising evidence. But then in the Millennials on War study, we found also mixed evidence. So in half of the countries, there was a gender gap when asked whether it was acceptable to use nuclear weapons. And then women were more opposed to the idea of that nuclear weapons were acceptable to use in any case. But in other countries, so in half of the countries, we found no gender differences. But then in other surveys, women were again more opposed to the use of nuclear weapons. So while there were some mixed evidence, we still concluded that there is evidence that women upheld the nuclear taboo more strongly than men. And lastly, we studied the gender differences in attitudes toward nuclear arms control and disarmament. And here we found very little to no gender difference. So actually, the very clear difference that we found was only when men were more likely to indicate that they were aware of nuclear disarmament treaties, so of the DPNW, for example. And actually, there were a lot of analytical studies who have identified that women respondents are more inclined to select don't know in such questionnaires, especially in questionnaires surrounding foreign policy and nuclear weapon policy. And possible explanation for this phenomenon have been put forward, focusing on the differences in socialized expectations. So men are more expected to be knowledgeable about these issues, while women are not. And also, it's found that women are more reluctant in saying that they're not knowledgeable about these subjects, where men are more eager to demonstrate that they know about these treaties. Sorry. So we also found that when considered outside the context of formal disarmament treaties, women seem to be more supportive of nuclear disarmament. So actually, when women were asked about whether the elimination of nuclear weapons worldwide would be supported, they were more supportive of this idea, while men were not. And also, women were more likely to say that nuclear weapons are dangerous in this world, and that while men actually said that they felt safer with knowing that the country had nuclear weapons or with the world having nuclear weapons. So to conclude, we listed a couple of policy recommendations. First of all, because we found that policy, the public opinion can have an effect on policy, it is important for policymakers to have that in mind, and also for disarmament advocates, because we saw that the salience surrounding nuclear weapons has really increased, and this increase of salience hasn't necessarily translated into a more disarmament sentiment among the public. So, for example, in Germany, more than half of the people in a poll in 2022 actually stated that they were more supportive of proliferation than they were before because of the threat of Russia. So this is why it's really important that there's enhanced engagement of disarmament advocates to really focus the awareness towards nuclear disarmament instead of proliferation. So this can also send a clear message to policymakers when there is more a disarmament sentiment. Moreover, because we found that there are gender differences, so especially in the use and in the proliferation, women were more likely to have concerns about this and to express anxiety. It is very important to also include these views. And now, because nuclear weapon policy making is still a very male-dominated field, and women perspectives are not represented because women are not included in these debates. So it's very important to have a more diverse team, to more include women in these debates, to have to really acknowledge these different perspectives and to acknowledge the concerns also of women. Then also we found that campaigners should use gender-specific messaging. So because women women are more concerned about humanitarian consequences, it would be useful for campaigners to really emphasize the humanitarian consequences. While, for example, for men, it would be useful to emphasize that nuclear disarmament would not lead to a decreased security. So because we found that men were more likely to say that they feel safe knowing that their country has nuclear weapons and to see the security guarantee, it would be helpful to, for example, stress that there are a lot of nuclear accidents, that nuclear weapons also pose a great threat. So to really emphasize on that when for specific messaging targeting men. And lastly, when studying these different articles, we still found that the male attitudes were seen as a norm. So we still found that what men had to say about nuclear weapons was normalized, while women perspectives were deviant from this norm. So this is, again, also very important to include women in these debates, because then this women perspective would be more normalized and would be more just central in these debates. And in this sense, also important to be aware that notion of masculinity and patriarchal attitudes play an important role in opinions on use of force. So this awareness should also be emphasized. So here I'll lead the floor again to James.
Okay. Many thanks, Ellen, for providing what I think was a really great overview of a really great paper. Just for your information, colleagues, the report section that Ellen and Michal put together is now available through a link in the chat, so you can go and find that. And just for your information, I will open up the Q&A shortly. It's good to see some of you have found the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And yes, to whoever asked the question, the recording of this will be made available. But if I could encourage you to please do send your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that you can find. But before we do open out to wider discussion, I'd like to turn to two discussants now for their input on this topic. And I'd like to start with Jamie Withorn, Jamie is a doctoral research fellow with the University of Oslo and an expert in US nuclear policy and non-proliferation. She also regularly conducts data analysis at the nexus of emerging technologies and nuclear issues, and has experience with the US federal government, as well as working with the United Nations and other international organizations, academia, and various non-governmental organizations focused on national and international security. I think it's also fairly safe to say that Jamie is particularly passionate about technology, security, and strategy related issues. So, Jamie, if I could start with you by asking for your reflections on the paper, but also your sort of take on the policy and scholarly implications, and the floor is yours.
Great. Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much to UNIDIR for co-hosting such an interesting event with us over at the Oslo Nuclear Project. For those of you who aren't aware of our work over at the Oslo Nuclear Project, I'll just let you all know that we're a research group based at the University of Oslo in the Department of Political Science. And we are composed of PhD students and doctoral fellows, as well as postdoctoral fellows and professors. And we conduct a wide range of research on various nuclear topics, and then also host events and do mentorship for the next generation of nuclear experts in Norway and abroad. I'll begin my remarks today by discussing some of my reflections from the paper in the presentation, and then I'll speak specifically more about key implications considering political science scholarship in particular. Overall, I think this paper does a really good job of addressing a pervasive problem in political science research, which is namely, how do we understand why certain people think differently and what might the effects of these differences be? I think your findings very clearly help demonstrate that there is indeed a gender variation, both in the existing weapons on nuclear weapons, or excuse me, in the existing research on nuclear weapons, but as well as in public opinion data and surveys and methodologies. I also think you do a good job of demonstrating that more should be done to include these diverse gender perspectives, not only when we're conducting nuclear weapons research in academia, but also when we're considering the overarching policymaking process. To that end, I found your paper did a really nice job of bridging the gap, so to speak, between rigorous academic research and understanding those broader policy implications. In particular, I found your results on approaching research from that normative lens to be really fascinating and intriguing. I think your research shows that it's worthwhile when we're conducting research on nuclear norms to ask whose norms are we accounting for, right? So when we're generating norms and we're analyzing how widespread these norms are and pervasive are, we have to kind of ask ourselves what assumptions we're making about who are the people behind those norms. I also think your research provides further nuance to understanding what norms exist and how they're distributed, which again helps both academics and policymakers. From a political science lens, I think your paper provides an important methodological contribution. Namely, you offer a critical analysis of the existing scholarship, and you provide a new perspective by looking at those crucial demographic factors. In this case, in particularly focused on gender. I think your paper is unique and it helps us as researchers to think more methodologically about differences in nuclear weapons and differences in nuclear weapons risk perceptions. Your paper demonstrates how researchers can begin to think about and establish variation. This is kind of a key theme throughout my remarks is I think you do a really nice job of establishing variation and showing how can we work with existing methods and data sets to find and uncover this variation and then address it and I guess think about it more with respect to policy implications. So I think the variation component is really important. You also demonstrate the relative novelty and emerging importance of public opinion research in nuclear weapons issues. As you mentioned, it's becoming increasingly more popular to rely on this as a method. So I think you're doing a good job of showing how that can be done well. And you also, I think, show how public opinion and relying on public opinion data will continue to grow in salience as nuclear weapons issues in public discourse continue to wax and wane given geopolitical realities. Specifically, again, talking about the political science and the structure of your analysis, I think it was a really innovative example of how to conduct a meta-analysis or how to rely on existing research for, again, novel implications. Often in political science, we see that many scholars, especially scholars who are wanting to conduct public surveys or public opinion research, they think they need to do some sort of extensive and very expensive novel data generation effort. But I think you guys do a really lovely job of showing you can actually rely on existing materials and find new resources. And so as a researcher myself, I think that that's a useful kind of approach to embody in future and ongoing research. I found it really interesting that you found a gender difference in nuclear proliferation and to a varying extent nuclear use, but you didn't find this gendered difference or variation in nuclear arms control and disarmament. I think this is surprising in some ways because often when we talk about disarmament or arms control in discourse, they're actually framed as perhaps more feminine or more soft, and so they have they tend to have these they're seen as not so techno-strategic in the words of Carol Cohn, and so they can be seen as more feminine in discourse. But as you say, there's actually not a gender difference, right? So I think that shows how by looking at different types of data sources, we can begin to establish where the gendered variation is actually. Another aspect of your research that I found quite interesting, and I would like to see kind of further analysis or elaboration on, and perhaps in the future, in future iterations, is the difference between nuclear weapon states, allies, or those party to extended deterrence agreements, and then non-nuclear weapon states, right? You do a good job of introducing this variation and beginning to discuss different structural factors that might affect the responses in addition to the demographic variables like gender. But I think looking a little bit further at this different and regional variation, as well as, again, structural security factors would be really interesting. To that end, you also often discuss how public opinion is useful because it informs the overall responsiveness of governments in democracies. I think it could actually be very interesting also to look at non-democracies, right? So in your study, you briefly mention and discuss Russia, but I think it would also be good to expand and look at countries that are viewing more autocratic and seeing what is the public opinion polling on nuclear weapons looking like in these countries as well, and then how are we beginning to account for governmental structural variation in addition to the gendered variation. So just kind of to wrap that up and put it more simply, I think considering these structural factors and variation alongside demographic indicators such as gender in this type of meta-analysis in future iterations of research would be very interesting. I'll just conclude by briefly discussing some shortcomings of the paper I noticed, though you do mention these in your paper themselves, so I know you are well aware of the limitations, so I won't spend too much time here. The issue always with surveys and public opinion data is that we have to always critically assess, are the results representative of a wider population? I think your study in particular has two potentials for bias and potential shortcomings that should need to be addressed through a methodological frame, and that is namely selection bias and external validity or generalizability. And again, you do mention both of these in your paper. But with respect to gender selection bias, I think, as you yourselves note, in surveys, women are often more accustomed to clicking "I don't know" in surveys. And so this could lead to an overrepresentation of men in the survey sample size. So just being mindful of that and trying to think about how might we in future surveys or in future meta-analysis, how might we begin to account for this "I don't know" gap, so to speak, and then account for that and try and correct that in potential selection bias. On generalizability, your sample was 39 reports, which is quite small. And you mentioned that it covers 47 countries in all geographic regions. But I looked at the online appendix in those case studies that you mentioned in the report, and they do seem to kind of veer Western, obviously. And this is, again, because you are relying on existing data. And so perhaps should you want to continue and do future research, perhaps conducting new surveys that are more regionally representative and less Western centric, that might also supplement the existing meta-analysis of these secondary sources. I think Latin America in particular was underrepresented in your data set. And so perhaps look, and this is especially interesting because it's a nuclear weapons free zone. So again, there could be that important variation and important insights that we're missing. So thinking kind of more geographically and about how we can find, or I guess, improve generalizability in future iterations of this type of method would be very useful. I'll conclude by just saying again that I think this is very important and innovative research, and I think it provides a very valuable contribution to the field of nuclear weapons issues. And I mean, I say that broadly to mean both political science and in the policymaking process. So overall, very well done.
Many thanks, Jamie. I think you raised a really good question about whose norms apply, as well as a number of other issues. And I think we take your point on the extent of representativity and really welcome your constructive comments. So thank you very much, Jamie. It's great to see there are some questions in the chat, and I'll turn back to Ellen and Michal shortly. I think there's questions on male-dominated societies, which I think was sort of links with one of Jamie's comments, and then also around languages. So I will turn to you shortly, but before doing that, I'm delighted to turn to our second discussant, Dr. Mariam Messmer, who is the Senior Research Fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House. She has extensive expertise in arms control, nuclear weapons policy issues, and Russia-NATO relations. Before joining Chatham House, Mariam was the co-director of BASIC, where she led the organization's work around nuclear risk and disarmament, nuclear risk reduction, I should say, and disarmament-related issues. So, Mariam, thank you for joining us. The same questions to you, so your reflections and the policy scholarly implications would be greatly appreciated. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you especially to Ellen and Michal for writing such an interesting paper and giving us the opportunity to talk about it today. Like Jamie, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I hope that my comments will add to what Jamie said rather than repeat. So I'll try to edit if I find that we said some of the similar things in our feedback. So I thought, thinking about the implications that this research has for policy, I think firstly and most fundamentally, understanding demographic gaps can help target policy decision-making better. And some of our research at Chatham House has also found that public opinion has an impact on nuclear policy making. Your paper makes the case, and our research on behavioral insights and nuclear risk has found that as well, where we looked at the role of public opinion on the ratification of arms control treaties in the US Senate. So we can sort of validate that finding, and I think it's an important one to highlight because, as you point out in your literature review, there are a lot of assumptions on public opinion being perhaps less relevant on some foreign and security policy decision-making processes than they are domestically. So I think that establishes the baseline as for why it's important to actually understand properly in policymaking what the gender disaggregation of public opinion is. If polls are only presented as averages, then that might actually obscure big differences between different genders. And for politicians, that might have really important consequences in terms of performing worse among a certain gender of voters, for example. So important to understand that. I also thought it was really interesting how you compared different national responses as far as you could. The other aspect of that I thought was really interesting was where you highlighted that if the threat perception changes, then gender differences of nuclear weapons choices might actually disappear. So I would be really interested in future research to see that sort of followed through a little more. And again, like Jamie, I understand that you're working with an existing data set, so you couldn't necessarily ask those follow-up questions. But I think it would be really interesting to consider what it means in a global environment where actually threat perceptions might globally change for the worse, whether that might actually encourage a public support of nuclear weapons proliferation. I think that would be really interesting to understand and to follow up on in future research. The other thing I wanted to follow up on is that your findings, on the one hand, seem to suggest that it's important, it sort of heightens the case for diversity at the leader level to ensure a balanced approach to risk. But on the other hand, I think it's important to consider to what extent a general population survey maps to elite or leadership opinions, since we know that elite groups often go through their own socialization process, which can override perhaps gender differences. And something that I thought I saw in your results was also that the gender differences disappear much more in nuclear possessor states. So it would also be really interesting to follow that up in research to figure out whether that holds up if you were to do additional survey data, perhaps that also disaggregates between elite and leadership opinions and general population opinions. And then, of course, we also have other studies that show us the impact of trying to fit into elite groups, especially for people from marginalized groups, such as women or perhaps people of color, though that's obviously not the point of your study, and what that can do to diversity of opinion. And I would particularly point to the nuclear straitjacket report from 2020 or 2021, I think, which the Center for New American Security published, which did really extensive research interviews with women who were in leadership roles in US nuclear policy, and the extent to which they felt that they had to fit into the existing paradigm. So I think for me, that makes the really important point that just focusing on demographic diversity doesn't necessarily work as a silver bullet in order to diversify decision making. And it also means that if there is such a socialization process that you have to undergo in order to qualify for leadership roles or in order to fit into elite groupings, then that might have an important impact on any gender differences in opinion on nuclear weapons policy. I think if we specifically focus on the implications that this research might have for nuclear disarmament advocacy, which was another area that I was asked to comment on, then I would say it's important to know about it and to make use of that knowledge, right? And that's also something that you highlighted in your own recommendations. At the moment, when policy campaigns tend to happen, they are rarely targeted or disaggregated by gender. But I think especially digital targeting through social media channels or similar mechanisms allows us to target people in quite a careful way by their gender, by other demographic characteristics. And that means that that policymakers or campaign groups could develop campaigns which show men and women messaging which statistically might work better for their gender. So I endorse your recommendation there, and I think it's really important. I also think this would be made even more powerful if it was further disaggregated by age, if we know more demographic information. So I think actually having additional survey results that perhaps are a little more fine-grained, also looking at age distributions, looking at ethnicity data, and so on, could be really helpful in that regard. The other bit I also wanted to comment on was something that Jamie also pointed out and that you also commented on, which was this finding that women are more likely to select don't know about nuclear weapons. Does that mean that we actually need an education and awareness raising campaign that is particularly aimed at women to plug that gap? We often talk about disarmament education and nuclear education more broadly. And there's a lot of that going on, and that is usually targeted at young people. But I'm wondering whether a campaign that perhaps targets women not so much as perhaps future leaders or the next generation of nuclear professionals, but women as informed citizens and voters who therefore need to know about security policy, disarmament policy, nuclear weapons policy, nuclear choices, and so on, could also be helpful. So because I think, and I say that not because, of course, I believe that women shouldn't be nuclear leaders, but because I think there's a difference if you target education at the next generation of leaders versus because you think it's something that is important for people to know about because they are citizens of democracies and they need to make informed choices. And I think that's particularly important for, of course, the nuclear possessor states that also are democracies and therefore want to see their nuclear choices legitimized in that way. And then finally, I just wanted to say a word on the nuclear policy field in general. And that's, of course, not something that you focus on in your paper, but it's just something that my mind returned to over and over again as I was digesting your findings and thinking about the survey results. So I think, as many of us have commented on before and have spoken about time and time again, the field is already polarized across the different silos, whether you see yourself as a deterrence expert, whether you see yourself as a disarmament expert. And that also comes with gendered expectations of who is an expert on what topics, which then also comes with sometimes quite unpleasant gendered baggage. So understanding the impact of gendered choices on public opinion might also enhance our understanding of the field, and it might help us understand where some of those views come from that can be quite harmful in terms of gendered biases. And that's also something that you point out when you say that, unfortunately, men's views are still often seen as the norms, whereas women's views are seen as divergent from the norm. And then the other aspect that I thought was really interesting, and this is a quote from your paper, is that you have this line where you say that men were more likely than women to express a sense of increased security thanks to nuclear weapons, while women were more likely to see them as hazardous. And this is something that we could very well see playing out in the nuclear policy field as a whole as well, if we have a situation where women might already be struggling to be taken seriously due to gendered biases. So how can we challenge gendered narratives and biases to then mean that people don't necessarily feel compelled into certain career paths because they feel welcomed or don't feel welcomed in a certain area? Finally, I just wanted to say I thought it was really interesting the brief note you had on the different results for India and the potential underlying reason about gendered societies and who has access to elite spaces. And I think this is something that also, to an extent, is echoed in the nuclear straitjacket report that I mentioned, though in a different societal context. And it might mean that certain public opinions will always be absent from decision-making spaces in those kind of societies just because of the elite filtering that goes on that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, just to conclude, I really enjoyed your paper. Thank you so much for writing it. And I think there's a lot in there that we can all learn from and that we can all take forward. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Marion. There's a lot to consider there. I think elite opinions, relations with nuclear possession states, making use of the knowledge is always something which I find particularly interesting, and then points around targeted disarmament, education, polarization, and gender choices. So, Ellen, there's a lot of comments there from Jamie and Marion for you to take on. We also have questions which have emerged. I'm going to put these to you, but I'll leave you to select which things you'd like to address. I'm sorry for overloading you here, but there was a point on male-dominated, and this is from the Q&A, point on how do you deal with this in male-dominated societies where most of the women don't know about nuclear treaties or disarmament, and I'm quoting from the Q&A point here. How can we include that group in nuclear proliferation or in this debate? Most people are politicized by security and the threat to national security. And then there's a more methodological question about languages of the academic research and surveys. So perhaps if I can hand over to you, Ellen, to take which of those you'd like to, and then, the floor is, the screen is yours. You okay? Ellen, can you hear me okay? It's over to you if you want to take those.
Yes, thank you. No, I was actually just thinking about the question and absorbing all the information it was giving. Very interesting, and all the comments were also very useful, and I really agree, and also I think there's a lot of room for further research because of this is really an initiation of the subject. But I find it very interesting that, for example, countries that are not no democracies, such as Russia, that they should really be also studied. And I think we really try to broaden the geographical scope, but I think there's a lot of research needed to really look at also specific countries, and also was mentioned to look at Latin America, for example, because they're not included, and this would be interesting because this is a zero nuclear zone, and to really compare this no nuclear zone to Europe, for example, to compare it to the US. So I think it's really interesting to also broaden the surveys and to also include more questions, that are maybe more accessible also for women, because they tend to say don't know on this question because maybe they are framed in a certain way. Also, to look at the question in the message box, I think in such societies, really educating women would be important to really to see that they're knowledgeable about these subjects. But I think that it's a long way to go, because especially in Pakistan, for example, it's a very male-dominated society, and I think it should be more. I don't think it's going to come from the government, but then more from the internet, for example, that they see more on social media these messages about nuclear disarmament, about nuclear weapon treaties. So in that way, women can maybe be more, they become more, can have more approach to these issues. And yeah, maybe if Michal also has some comments.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for intervening without James's invitation. Thank you very much for having us, and thanks again to Marion and Jamie for fantastic comments. I want to add to what Ellen's started to answer when it comes to the question about male-dominated societies. One of the things that we often need to take into consideration is that well, first of all, it's really hard to measure objective knowledge, who knows about things and who doesn't know about things. And from the existing research which exists, and it's very limited, we actually see that there is the gaps in objective knowledge about nuclear weapons. And I'm now not talking about treaties, but in general, knowledge about nuclear weapons. The gap between men and women is not as big as many make it to be. Women are much more likely to say in surveys that they don't know, which often comes because males are socialized into sort of not accepting don't know as a valid answer. Let's put it this way. But interestingly, as we also report in our paper, when you look at, for example, elite responders, so when we asked, for example, members, we reported on a survey that was done among the members of German Bundestag. Once you ask elite responders, the responses don't know among women are much lower, which means that they are often sort of socialized into similar norms as their male colleagues, and that leads to a change. So I'm all for disarmament education, and I think it's very important. But I would also caution against saying that very often that women are particularly less suited group to engage in this area. I also noticed the point about surveys and questions. So as we report in the paper, we basically went through the surveys that were published in recent years, and we looked at So our initial search was in English, but we also looked at journal papers which were published in main academic databases. So we looked also at work that was published, not necessarily, which was published also in other parts of the world. From the top of my head, I don't know if we ended up with any that were done in other languages. I mean, the surveys often are obviously executed in other languages, but they're often reported in English language publications because all of the authors want to have a global publicity for their work, and that is easiest gained through publishing in English. And so I think while we do have a certain bias, I also think that bias is actually smaller than assumed, because NGOs across the world often publish press releases of their work in English, or the researchers all across the world publish their findings in English. I also noticed one more question in the Q&A, which was focused on the shifts in public opinion and whether we can see whether it's the men or the women that shift. And there I would underscore again that there is quite a limited amount of research that would actually look at the same respondents over time. And so it's really difficult to talk about shifts or to talk about how things change over time. And so this remains a scope for future research. Before giving the floor back to James and to the audience, I heard from both Jamie and from Marion that there is more global research needed. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the work which has been done by Lauren Sukin and Stephen Herzog, who have recently conducted a survey in 40 different countries, and their work is coming out any day. Thank you.
Many thanks to Ellen, but also thanks to you, Michal. There's no invitation required at all, so please do feel free to jump in. Thank you also for clarifying the question. I think it was from NOMS on languages and academic researchers and surveys. And I welcome any other questions if people would like to submit those through the Q&A function. We invite those. But also, if either of our discussants, Jamie, Marion, if you'd like to take the floor, you are absolutely more than welcome. I can't see any for the moment. I mean, I have additional questions from my side. I mean, quite basic questions. I mean, for yourself, the most interesting findings and what are the things that really surprised you in the research process as well, Alan? So there's a question for you there, but also feel free to respond or follow up on any of the other points. And the floor is yours, Alan.
Thank you for your question. So what really surprised me was, of course, that we didn't find gender differences when it comes to nuclear disarmament and arms control, because as Marion also pointed out, that actually when you look at nuclear disarmament, that it's mostly feminine perspectives, and that is mostly dominated by feminine roles, and that there is actually polarization when you look at the deterrence side of nuclear weapon policymaking and the nuclear disarmament side. So this polarization was already established, so that's why it was really surprising to find that there were no gender differences found in this area. And I maybe think because, as we said, there is not enough education, and I really like the point also of Marion that we should really broaden the education for the population more generally. So not only for the elite, because as Michal also said, the elite women are tended to be more knowledgeable already about nuclear weapon policy making. However, they also have these gender roles, so that being a strong leader or being present at these discussions, mostly they have to take on these male attributes because they're seen as more strong. So I think that's why it's also important to really include the general public and also include more women who normally wouldn't really think about these issues because also of these generalized expectations of society. So I think that's a really good point made. And moreover, what I found surprising was the study in Japan that when actually the threats increased, that women were not more opposed to nuclear weapons, because I would think that because they see nuclear weapons as more hazardous, as more risky, that even when there is a greater threat, that they would still be more opposed to nuclear weapons because of the humanitarian consequences and because of the human cost. So that was also surprising for me. And yeah, also in South Korea that we didn't find gender differences was also surprising because of the nuclear threat of North Korea so close by. And I would think that because also of the risk and because also yeah, just because of the risk and of the consequences, that women would also maybe be more a little supportive of nuclear weapons. So maybe it's also interesting to see at different cultures and whether why in South Korea, for example, there was no gender difference found. So to really broaden the survey as to question maybe their gender roles are different or women perceive nuclear weapons differently. So I think that would also be very interesting to look at different cultures, and also maybe we see gender roles as generalized in all these in the West, but also in different parts of the world. But maybe it's not that generalized as we know. So especially when it comes to nuclear weapon attitudes. So I think there's a lot of room for further research. So these are my first notes on that question.
Many thanks, Ellen. I'm actually curious to see whether either of our discussants, Marion or Jamie, if you'd like to come in. I'm also conscious, Marion, you mentioned a point on behavioural insights. If there's points you'd like to raise there at all. Sorry, Jamie, you've unmiked, so the screen is yours, if that was intentional. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just had a quick two finger actually on that, because I had kind of two follow-up questions, I guess. I'm very interested in the word hazardous, in how they're associating the word hazardous with proliferation as opposed to, say, nuclear risk. And so I'm curious if in this data that, because this seems one to be kind of an outdated way that we speak about nuclear risk and actual radioactive material exposure, and how it might affect, say, women's health in particular. And so I'm curious if there's like a time frame there, or if you disaggregated, say, nuclear weapons public opinion versus nuclear energy and or other radioactive materials. And so that was kind of one question I had. And then also to follow up too, because we've established that it's difficult to have trends or establish timelines, long periods of time, because it's a relatively new method. But I'm curious if you've thought about pairing this type of meta-analysis with additional methods to help perhaps do some more in-depth looks at your findings. But those are just two questions I had rather than discussing comments.
Thanks, Jamie. Ellen, did you want to take that question now? I'm conscious I was going to turn to Marion and then Renata. I don't want to leave you out, so if you want to take the floor, but perhaps, Ellen, if you want to follow up, the screen is yours.
Yes, so question regarding the hazardous versus risky, and also regarding nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. So, for example, a study of Lisa Brandes, which was conducted in 1919, but actually covered public opinion polls from the US and the UK from after the Second World War until 1980 something. She found that women were more likely to say that their nuclear weapons were hazardous in the means that they were more afraid of the consequences of nuclear weapons. They were more afraid of the uncontrollable and catastrophic consequences. But then another study of in 2022 of Herzog also in US, he found that women were more likely to be afraid of the radiation risk, and that they were also more afraid of they were not supportive of the research and development, and they were more afraid of the accidents, but also more afraid of nuclear power plants. So this was also seen like in one comprised together nuclear weapons, but also nuclear weapon energy as just more risky because of the radiation effects, while in Lisa Brende's studies, I found more that nuclear women were more afraid of nuclear weapons itself, about the consequences, about the human costs, and because I think also because the bombs that dropped in Japan was also not that long ago. From the surveys that she asked, that there's more that image of this human cost. And then in more later studies, it's more about the development, the research and development, and about nuclear power plants and the energy. And for the methodological question, I didn't think about it yet, but I think we should really combine different methods to have a more comprised view on this, and maybe also do I'm still thinking actually about these methods, and it's a really good point made, because now we're really into just having all these comprise all these surveys and the data and doing this in this specific method. But I think it would be really interesting to expand. But maybe, that's my comment for now.
I may add a really nerdy answer to the question about the data analysis thing. In order to be able to do this sort of analysis, you would need to have a much bigger number of surveys. A really nice example of that is a dissertation published by Jamie Kwong, who defended her dissertation at King's College London, I think 2 years ago. She did this study on American public opinion on Korean nuclear program, and she collected thousands and thousands of surveys on how Americans think about Korean nuclear program. And then it is possible to sort of do a really deep dive into analysis. But we weren't able to find thousands and thousands of surveys because there are no thousands and thousands of surveys collected. And so that might restrain on our opportunities for what we actually can do and what we can analyze. Because this partially answers a question which James asked earlier about what was one of the surprising findings, is that there's actually quite little empirical work on how trying to find a more gendered or intersectional lens on public opinion on nuclear weapons. There is enormous and growing number of body of work on public opinion and nuclear weapons. But once you start sort of diving deeper into, so what are the patterns, what are different societal groups, and it's not necessarily only about gender, it can be also about age groups, about ideologies, and so on and so forth. And as soon as you want to move away from the United States, it sort of becomes very shaky and there is very little work. So I think in that respect, we hope that our paper will encourage others to do more work in this area. Also academically, it's also very good if we have any younger talents in the audience. It's also a very good topic for bachelor, master, doctoral thesis. So it's the future is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen and Michal. I just should also add, nerdy input is always welcome in these discussions and should be at all times. I have a couple of questions that started to emerge in the chat, but I did want to follow up and turn to you, Marion, to give you the floor. Thank you for your patience.
No problem at all. I guess just quickly from me. So almost a year ago now, we published a paper here at Chatham House where we looked at some initial findings on what behavioral insights could do in terms of helping us make better nuclear policy choices. And one of the things that I think is also relevant for this paper here and the survey research is that an area that looked really interesting was tweaking how policy language is used, because there's a lot of research into behavioral studies that shows that it really matters how you phrase certain things. And I think if some of the survey research that's disaggregated by gender finds that actually men and women might react differently to different wording, and also if we can extrapolate that finding further by saying that elite and non-elite groupings might react differently to different phrasing, or different age groups might react differently to different phrasing, then I think that poses a really interesting question for further research and further study, which would allow us to potentially target messaging much better when it's about policy, but also target messaging that's aimed at other states much better. That was the initial impetus for our research, that we wanted to understand how differences in translation, differences in understanding deterrence concepts and so on might impact on levels of risk, because our hypothesis was that there's a lot that could get lost in translation. But I think basically having more knowledge of these differences and how people react to messaging that's specifically targeted at them and is meant to be designed to be easily digestible for them specifically, could be a really interesting way, and is something that I think is going to get more and more easy to do as we've got more differentiated messaging channels available to us through different online channels, through social media and so on. So perhaps something to consider, though I also understand that for a lot of governments it gets very complicated to need to think about these very fine-grained audiences. But from a research perspective, I think really fascinating and something that could be interestingly combined.
This sounds like a fascinating study, and I would like to follow up on that, because this sounds really interesting.
Thank you both. Thanks, Marion, in particular. I was struck particularly by the potential for use for good or evil with some of those targeted messaging. Renata, you've been very patient there. I don't know whether you'd like to take the floor. Otherwise, we have 3 questions in the chat, which I'll follow up on shortly with you, Ellen. But Renata, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'll just be very brief because I also saw the questions in the chat box. First, Marion, if you can share the link on the chat with everyone for this report. I think everybody is really interested in learning more about this work that Chatham House did. And my question is just like, because at UNIDIR Gender and Disarmament program, we are always, interested in advancing understanding of policy issues, through a gender lens. And what we see is a lot of the times research is really not disaggregated by gender. The research design doesn't consider these variables to begin with. And they don't do that a lot of the times, because there is this idea that it's not. Many researchers have looked at this. It's Carolina Criado Perez has this great book about invisible women, about how a lot of research assumes men as the default, and then, just take it from there. So a lot of research design does not consider gender differences, but also because it potentially is also more expensive to do a research that actually look into these variables. So I just wanted to hear, especially maybe from Michal, because he does a lot of research or reviews a lot of research on public opinion. And I'm sure when people take these surveys, they need to, provide a bit of context about who they are. So possibly the research, the variables regarding gender and age are being collected, I assume, but are they not necessarily being reported in the results? Do you think this is a matter of awareness or a matter of resources, or a matter of, like the scholarly culture? How do you see this more general aspect of, data disaggregation in research design and reporting findings?
Just before you answer, Michal, if I could say, there is a link to the paper that Marion spoke of earlier, which is in the chat. You should be able to find that. And there are 3 questions also in the Q&A. So, Michal, if you want to take any of those, and I'll just go through them very briefly. But there's a question here, and you mentioned no difference between women and men in attitudes in South Korea. What could be an explanation? There's a question about the risks in mapping gender differences in this manner, which ties into the point raised by Renata in some ways. And then a question on methodology. So could you elaborate further on the conditional variables used in the study? So perhaps if I can turn to you first, Michal, and then Ellen will give you the near to the final word. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll start with the question that Renata asked, and then I'll go to the Q&A. there is really, gender is very often thought as a control variable. And so people report very little on it. And I think this is a pity because it basically delegates it to some sort of a second or third rate issue of second or third rate importance. And with this paper, we actually wanted to bring it to an issue of first rate importance because we think it really matters who is responding and how they are responding to different questions. You know, if we had a marketing conference, it would be sort of obvious that, you know, different demographics require different messaging. But in the political science world, it seems to still require sort of persuading people that same messaging might not work exactly the same for everyone else. And so there isn't much quantitative empirical work in that respect. Working with there is fantastic work on gender and nuclear weapons, and I don't want to sort of sidestep that, but there is very little that sort of looks at public opinion, that looks at numbers, that looks at quantitative attitudes. And so we try to sort of stimulate that work as well. When it comes to the question about the control variables, so what we tried to do was to report, we tried to sort of look at the descriptives. So we initially wanted to do a meta-analysis, which would basically mean taking all the data that was shared and sort of reanalyzing it and try to sort of control for many other things. And we soon realized that this was not possible because for many of the studies, the data was simply not available. And so what we resorted to was to take and report the descriptives that existed among men and women, and as they were reported by the scholars. And so what you see is mostly analysis without controlling for other factors. Having said this, unless there is a massive problem in the sampling, there shouldn't be differences such as age or education among men and women in the sample. And then there is a third point on how to address the remaining gaps in understanding the gender and what the scholars can do and what practitioners can do. And I think both Ellen and Marion and Jamie in their remarks very deftly explained that there is a great space for improving knowledge, but also for taking these views very seriously and sort of being interested in these different in various cross sections and various constituencies is already an important step forward.
Many thanks, Michal. Ellen, I wanted to give you the last word for the Q&A session. There are 3 questions which I went through, but also any additional remarks or comments or thoughts will be most welcome from your side. And you have the screen.
Thank you so much. So the last point that Michal made was, I think it's very important, so that maybe because also Renata asked the question why that women, why that gender or age. Yeah, mostly when you have to fill in a questionnaire, you have to fill in whether your gender or your age, and why it's not made like an important point. And because mostly it is noted, but I think because there is maybe before there was not an interest, or maybe they just didn't think it was important to mention these differences in demographics. So that's why I think the point that Michal made was that it was really important to really address these demographical differences because of the intersectionality of this, and because women and people of color and these minorities in the field of nuclear weapon policy, they are left out. So it's really important to really address this and to be aware of the demographical differences. So I think that's just the main points from this paper, that we have to be aware of these differences because there are differences, and these differences are important, and policymakers should should account for these differences, because in this way, the feminine perspective would also become a norm, or become more easily a norm. So yeah, that's my final remark.
Many thanks, Ellen. Indeed, thank you to all of our panelists and discussants. I should point out we're also joined by Ambassador Tormod Endersen, who is the permanent representative of Norway to the United Nations in Geneva and has been patiently following this discussion. I should add also thank you for joining and thank you for your ongoing support for gender and disarmament, but also across a lot of UNIDIR's work, which is very greatly appreciated. But I did want to turn to you to give you the floor for some closing remarks, and the floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, James, and hello, everyone. It's been a pleasure to follow this discussion. A particular hello to people in my hometown, Oslo, and with the Oslo Nuclear Project. I think this has been super interesting and a very, very sort of solid proof that policy needs to be informed by research. And I would like to thank Ellen and Michal for their paper. I found that very, very interesting, not least the findings that are somewhat counterintuitive when it comes to the gendered view on the threat that nuclear weapons pose. I mean, I guess it's a generally held assumption that women would be more afraid of nuclear weapons, while I found it interesting that in Japan and in Korea, where the threat is very real, these differences become less. And I assume that we're all living in a new security environment, not least in Europe, where we have a intrastate war going on, and where security policy comes very much to the fore in many capitals. So I'd be interested to see whether, I guess this is a trend that can go both ways. That you can say the perceived threat makes people more likely to accept nuclear weapons, but it can also go the other way. And I think, Marion, you asked a question pertaining to this, that you have a shift in public opinion towards resisting nuclear threat when the threat becomes more real. So I think I would then here say something that all researchers love to hear, that more research is needed, right, to get this clarified. But I think it was super interesting, and regardless of the variation, obviously, what we can state as a fact is that effective policies in this area, like in every other area, needs to be inclusive. I mean, we need to take into account the variety of different views in order to establish efficient policies. And one sort of no-brainer is that we need more women around the table in disarmament work and in the armed forces and in many other places. So it was a strong argument for inclusion, regardless of the finer detail. It was also what you say. I mean, something that came to my mind was that this is also a strong argument for democracy. And Jamie, you were touching upon this, that maybe we should also look at, unfortunately, the majority of the countries in the world which are not democracies and where decision makers do not answer to the populations to various degrees. I mean, how does this discourse influence them? Because I mean, the premise that public debate influences policy is, of course, it should be that way. It is that way in democracies, but it's certainly not that way in every country. So a strong argument, I think, for democracy and for politicians and leaders that actually answers to their populations. So I should say that Norway is very happy to support this work. We are, in general, happy to support viewing disarmament efforts through a gender lens, and then there's also, I would agree that there's also other diversity considerations than gender that could be relevant for disarmament issues, such as nuclear verification, which is an area where we have been very active for many years. By way of example, I guess inspection teams with a diverse composition will be more effective than inspection teams that are only men, my age, with a military background, for instance. So just to let you know, we have in addition to verification, we've also been championing gender mainstreaming and the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we'll, of course, continue to do so in this work going forward. So I would like to close by saying thanks a lot to UNIDIR and to the researchers that have informed our discussion. It was super interesting. And again, a clear sign to me that, policies to be effective and relevant need to be informed by science and research, exactly like the one that we have been lucky to learn about today. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ambassador. And I think I speak for all of us on the call when I say that I think researchers do indeed like to hear that more research is required. It remains for me just to thank all of our panelists and discussants for taking the time to join us today. So thank you, Ellen, Michal, Marion, and Jamie. I really appreciate this. Thank you, of course, to Renata as the head of our program here. Thank you to Norway, particularly Ambassador Andresen, for the ongoing support for gender and disarmament and the wider work of the Institute. And thanks to all those of you who have taken time from your day to join the discussion, to ask some really interesting and insightful questions, which are really very much appreciated. And remarkably, for a Zoom meeting, unless you want to add anything else, Renata, I think we can perhaps finish before time to go against the grain. I can't see anything from Renata, so thank you all, and I wish you a good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever this finds you. All the best.